In Chapter 2 of Matter and Memory, Bergson is attempting to understand the role of memory in our everyday interactions with the world and our cognition moving about the world, where perceptions are formed and informed by memory. And throughout the chapter, he focuses on medical information and accounts of various conditions that interrupt the ability to speak or recognize words. And what he wants to show is that language is a meeting point between our motor memory and our pure recollection memory, which he delineates at the beginning of the chapter. These two forms of memory are divergent and are different in kind rather than by degree. They go in different directions, he'll say. Habit memory repeats the past in the present. It reenacts the past. And its tendency is towards inertia, staying the same and having a resistance towards change. Pure memory, on the other hand, is the unrepeatable aspect of each moment being utterly unique and having its place in the irreversible series of time. So we can say that the past manifests itself in the present in two modes: inertia, and through an effort to build momentum which achieves the inertia that is the enduring of that state. We have to put effort into forming a habit and gaining skills, but then once they have been achieved, we do not require the same degree of attention on them, this voluntary attention, this spiritual activity, as he'll understand it also. This interaction of memory in the active process. Eventually we can go about our life without having to pay attention exactly to what we're doing, and we can drift off into thought or have a conversation, and our automatic habitual memory can guide us. So he wants to explore this distinction between habit memory and pure memory in the case of language. How do these things come together such that we can speak and understand each other? He wants to check his theories through these clinical studies of language disorders. And ultimately, he's going to argue that memories are not stored in the brain. Memory images are not stored or produced by the brain either. The brain prepares movements. It organizes our sensations in relation to our action. It is a dynamic organ that helps organize our behavior, our sensory motor system, our coordination. It's the organ that organizes our habit memory. If memories were really stored in the brain, we would be recording so much information, a truly infinite task. Each moment of our experience is unique in history, and every experience is a duration that can be divided without limit into phases, details, gradations. We would be saving terabytes of information every minute. The brain is an incredibly complex feat, right? It is a miracle of complexity. But it hasn't been proven to be this powerful. And it really doesn't need to be, and this is what Bergson is showing us. If retention is a property of consciousness, the power to preserve and to prolong our past psychological facts occurs within consciousness and does not need to occur within the brain. The brain prepares the attitude of our body to have the memories come to us. The same way that an actor assumes the posture and the facial expression of the emotion in order to have that emotion grow in them. They foster the emotion by taking on a certain position and attitude of the body. Ultimately, Bergson wants to say that there's a kind of resonance between the body assuming a certain attitude and preparing certain movements, and that memories can actually turn into sensations in the body because the body has already experienced the configuration of the memory. the body is prepared and ready to have all of these sensations vibrate together in the same way that they did at the moment that we experienced that memory. Near the end of the chapter, he gives the image of an immense keyboard, and he says that the region of images that we experience, this multiplicity of sensations and our being in the world and part of its flux, that this is really like an immense keyboard in that it's as if we have a million strings, and each one is ready to be bowed, right? Like a violin string is bowed. And when they are bowed, they produce sensations, they produce feelings and qualities. It's as if at every moment 1,000 notes are being hit, right? Through all of our senses of our body, through sight, through hearing, through touch, through smell. Each moment is a unique chord where all of these notes are vibrating together and harmonizing with each other and forming an ordered whole. This is actually remarkably similar to Ernst Mach's view in the analysis of sensation of how hearing works. He thinks that in the ear we have thousands of tiny hairs, and each one of these hairs is attuned to the tones that are coming into the ear. And so each is at a certain pitch, we could say, but rather than each hair only accepting one frequency and then there being gaps between them, no, instead each hair is adjusting itself to the vibration that is closest to it. It's tuning itself to that note. And then thousands of these are being tickled at every second, and is accounting for part of the range of the tonal space. And all of our sounds are not obviously musical tones, but we can actually form any sound out of a bunch of very small sine waves. We can put together a bunch of sine waves to make noise. Even something like a note on a piano has tons of overtones and noise as well. There's the hammer noise. All of that is actually spanning a huge range of frequencies. So it's not as if you hit one note on a piano, you have one frequency that's being agitated within the inner ear hairs. Now, the ear itself needs to undergo certain changes in order to hear language. Bergson brings up the example of listening to a foreign language, and in this, if it is a language that we really have no comprehension of, we are not going to be able to tell where one word starts and where another word stops. We cannot even figure out the basic articulations of it into phrases and words. Bergson will want to say that through habituation, through the formation of motor schema, we form a motor schema through habituation, and this requires that there be a material change to our organs, that there be a modification of our tissues, both in the brain and the sense organs. Cases of sensory aphasia are of this sort, Bergson says. It is as if one hears their own language as a foreign language because there's no motor organization, there's no sensory motor schema because of a lesion or because of damage to some area in the brain. The complex movements of speech made by our lungs and our tongue and the shape of our mouth, all of this is prepared in the brain. There are coordinated movements of speech, organizing these movements together, and we execute them without thinking about them. They have to be happening on their own, automatically. They have to be matching our intention to speak and to enunciate in the right way. We monitor our progress as we speak and make sure it's coming out the way that we intend it to. When we hear someone speak, there is an active engagement through our body, through our automatic attention, what he would also call motor attention, and which he opposes to voluntary attention or imaginative attention. And here Bergson creates this idea of a motor diagram, and it's not exactly the same as the motor schema. The motor diagram occurs within the processes of our habit body, our automatic attention, our motor schema. What our motor schema does in speech is that it follows the sounds and it traces the important parts. So it has learned to follow speech patterns of a certain language and to find certain aspects of those sounds to be the most important and salient. And it forms this tracing, which he calls the motor diagram. And this is not a repetition of the words where we speak them within our brain or within our throat and eardrum and vocal cords. He says that it need not be a complete repetition of the speech. It need only trace the most important parts of it. These nascent movements appeal to a certain idea, to a certain effort, to enact a certain movement, to execute a movement, but prior to that execution or without that execution actually being actualized. We don't need to have the complete physiological actualization of speaking quietly under our breath the words that we're hearing. We need not think that the words are repeated entirely, but only that traces of actualization, which hint at a certain set of movements that could be actualized in such a repeating. There's a sort of sonorous afterimage of every word that we hear that kind of rings in our ear, and this fills in the trace such that then the imagination and memory make sense of something already organized and already tending in a certain direction, right? The sounds are already partially organizing and moving in the direction of the thoughts that our memories fulfill within them. In a way, our sensory motor system, by producing a motor diagram, is transcribing a system of sensations into sort of coded system of sensations where we are not perceiving only the word spoken with a specific tone to that person's voice and from a certain distance and anything else that will modify the sensation as a pure data with unique qualities and as a singular psychical event in our life. The motor diagram kind of generalizes away from these differences in purely sonic modification. And so the memories behind this are not the individual memory of every time we've ever heard a word, but a sort of motor memory that transcribes our sensation of speech into motor diagrams that we fill with memories. The motor diagram traces and distinguishes the different parts of the sound, opening our attention to see within the continuity all of the differentiations of the parts and see in each of the parts some reflection of the whole. And here Bergson brings in the idea of melody, where we sort of hear in each note a reflection of the rest of the melody. A note in a melody is not just simply C or F or something like that. It is a unique quality within the melody that it's in. It takes on its own significance. The fact that one note in one melody is a C and in another melody is a C, they could play completely different roles in those two different melodies. So that is not the distinguishing factor of the meaning of a note in a melody. And so too in speech, the individual sounds and the individual words are less these isolated pieces of information and more a reflection of the whole of the sentence that is being uttered. Bergson's right that we can't understand or analyze the meaningfulness of the units within a foreign language, but certainly we can pick up the gestural, emotional qualities, and these are more similar to our experience of music. And this is really similar to musical transcription in a way. We can feel the meaning of the music just by listening to it, but it takes an incredible skill to be able to transcribe any passage of music. And this is very difficult for me listening to a passage. I mean, I can pick out immediately, what is the time signature. I could generally find the key that it's in pretty quickly, especially with an instrument, but even by ear. But I cannot just simply tell you all the notes in a melody. And there are people who have trained and can do this effortlessly. They do no active synthesis in the way that everything that I do is effort and active synthesis. I hear the note, I try and sing something in my memory, try and compare it, see externally relates to it. Other people hear these things and immediately know how to transcribe that music into sheet music. Likewise, expert linguists can immediately tell you what any word is and what type of word it is and what function it has within any given context. The average person hears the words and understands how they function in the sentence as a meaningful whole, but do not understand the individual function that each word is necessarily having. Now, the sensory motor system can go about creating these motor diagrams, but unless this is met with active attention, with voluntary imaginative intention, it will not form into larger wholes. It will not create a coherent sense of meaning. Each sentence assumes a certain attitude, a certain voice, and an attitude has memories that graft themselves onto it, and this increases its energy and pushes it more in that direction. It leads to a certain inertia in thought, a certain momentum, right? As soon as we're in an attitude, we tend to deepen that attitude and stay in it. It grows. It's a sort of active force, and the active force is coming through an intensification of psychical energy, and yet also an inertia that keeps it going within the body. The same thing goes for a motor schema and even nascent movements. All of them are gathered and tend in several directions until they start to converge on a single direction. Many nascent movements and motor schemas are initiated and prepared, although they're not activated, and as they gradually pass from virtuality to actuality, they wander and flex until a direction emerges, and there's an accumulation of psychical energy in a certain direction towards action, and the action becomes more and more inevitable. Currently, I'm working on building a sauna out in my yard, and oftentimes it's hard to get up the momentum to actually start working on it. But as soon as I actually achieve that and I do get the momentum and I start working on it, I'll work on it for 3 or 4 hours and I'll get a bunch of work done. And while there's a sort of resistance there, as I become, as I overcome more and more hurdles, soon the idea of building it fully manifests itself in action. It becomes more and more inevitable until I'm doing it, and then I'm doing it. Any complex action or speech in general is a kind of psychophysical orchestration of concerted movements and memories, weaving a continuous melody of action, and it can modulate at any moment to fit a new attitude. And I would almost say that the imagination is to memory what motor schemas are to the body, and even more so what the motor diagram is to our motor schemas. We can think of the body not as just an object in space, but as actually all of our dynamic habits and our movements and the sort of attitudes that our body assumes. Our body doesn't just make possible certain emotions and sensations, but it actually is those emotions and sensations. It doesn't just make possible movements, it is those movements. And an idea we should remember for Bergson is something very closely related to the body. It is a sort of motive and attitude and the context in which one thinks this idea. It is defines what the idea is ultimately by the concrete state of our mind and our body in that moment. And every idea is thinkable only in its concrete context by the one who thinks it, even though we can have ideas repeat in time. An idea shapes our behavior. It tends towards action, and it allows for actions of greater complexity as memory-laden imagination fills our motor schemas. And the idea is going to relate in some way to a representation, but this representation is a sort of slice within our psychophysical flux, within the becoming of our psychophysiology. The representation relates to the idea as a kind of symbol of the idea. And this is very similar to a noun. A noun is the kind of representation and symbol of the complex whole. An idea is a psychological fact. It is, or perhaps maybe it's a combination of psychological facts. And in a sense, we can't have the same idea as Kant, for example, right? And an idea is involved in the total background and the entire horizon of someone's experience. It touches the whole of our psychical being. When we look at Kant, we see the contradictions that he didn't see, and we see none of the motives that led him to not see those. Kant could never explicitly discuss every motive behind his ideas. He could not give us the total background, and no one could. So our ideas are organized into systems within our consciousness, and a lot of this is learned from our language and our upbringing and our culture. But ultimately, every idea is a figure standing out of a background, and that background is singular for each of us. This singularity and uniqueness does not mean solitude and division, but we all have a unique perspective on each other and the total system of images. Let me say a little bit more about movement, inertia, force, and how Bergson is relating these properties of matter to the mental energy, the psychical energy. Bergson thinks that habit is a vital activity, but understands inertia to be essential to habit. But, and this is coming partially from the psychology lectures of 1893 to 4, inertia is what maintains habit, is what preserves the past in the present. You know, it's almost as if that there was a force always being actualized in a musician that is pushing them towards playing music. In daily life, when they're not playing music, there's enough other resistant forces that are pushing it back, but it is constantly there trying to actualize itself. One automatically hums and sings because this activity, always endeavoring and not necessarily actively because of our will, it is always endeavoring to realize itself. So there's something like a psychical inertia, and this is what Bergson calls the virtual. And Bergson actually looks at the idea of inertia and tries to show that its significance is born from our psychical facts. Clearly, inertia is something like a preservation of the past in the present. It is a persisting, direction of movement or a state of rest. And it is something that is enduring and continuous, which means that inertia is known by memory, right? We have a system of sensations, and we alter these sensations somehow. We either walk away from there and then come back, we leave and return, or we look away, or we stare at it over a certain duration. And we see that earlier moments saved in our memory are comparable to the present sensations. And so we compare past to present in order to make sense of inertia. Solidity of matter is nothing. It is unknowable beyond our affirmation that our sensations are analogous to past sensations. and will appear analogous to new sensations in the future. Our experience of time also is a sort of integration of embodied time and of memory. And we can think embodied time is very similar to this motor diagram. It has to do with our habit body and our ability to discern and analyze our experience in the body, not through our consciousness and not through a kind of concept or mental analysis, but through an embodied analysis. For example, we can think of learning any skill or learning a dance or something like that. We find all of the different movements and we isolate them and we make sure each one is moving in the way that it's supposed to. And then we compose and decompose and compose and recompose over and over again, analyzing and shifting and tuning each of these movements until we no longer are dealing with something broken up and multiple, but we are in one stroke organizing the whole and moving as one in a concerted movement. Embodied time is already deeply complex phenomenologically and involves a kind of depth. It's felt in our embodied motion, right? That when we move, there's a before and an after, and there is a elongation of the moment into the future and the past. Our experience of any force or inertia or organization is always elongated both in our bodily adaptation as well as in our memory images. Habit is the embodiment of the past. It is a enactment of the past, right? And we can think of work as a sort of goal-oriented action is an embodiment of a plan. It is having some goal in mind based on our memories and organizing our action towards fulfilling something at least satisfactory to that expectation. Now, we experience movement in a number of different ways. Bergson is going to talk about this in depth in chapter 4. He thinks that we, for the most part, don't understand motion and movement because we analyze it and we translate it into space, essentially. But it's not as if we have no experience of movement because we're completely stuck in these static ideas and all we have is translations of movement into concepts and space, which are themselves static and devoid of movement. We do have an immediate experience of movement still. First of all, vitally within our body, within our sensory motor system. We interact with the world, we move about it. And we're engaged in that movement, and so we don't understand it in a philosophical or in a theoretical sense, but we understand it in a embodied and intuitive sense. We also can encounter movement meaningfully in the case of aesthetic and moral sentiments, such as grace and sympathy. Grace and sympathy are a very unique type of movement. Now, the analysis of movement, we can think of that in terms of a reduction of movement to places within space. We can also think of a number of other forms of analysis of movement. I mean, we can find different types of movement, right? This goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle says there's locomotion, moving from one place to another. There's also alteration, which is the alteration of a single quality. So something becomes hotter or colder. The color of a leaf changes from green to yellow and brown. And when we think of this alteration, we compare an earlier moment to a later moment. We set them next to each other, and we overlay them or imagine them next to each other as differences. Similarly, with the idea of growth, we see something get larger or smaller, and we can superposition them on top of each other to see that one takes up more space than the other. So indeed, all of these ways of understanding movement ultimately return us back to space and a comparison of two different times. But there's another kind of change that is less suitable to this kind of transposition, and that is genesis, generation. In generation, we see one thing change into another. The most obvious example is things like boiling water and seeing it turn into steam. There's a change of form going on here, according to Aristotle. And this is very similar to habit, which is another form of genesis. And here we cannot simply translate these into space and compare them as two different points in time. Within the continuity of the actualization of habit, act and potency interrelate. There's a continuity between them, but there's a kind of asymmetrical coexistence. In order to form a habit, we have to have some potential, and we have to put that potential into action. But we are also changing our potential in the process, and we are shifting in certain ways potentials that are the potential to learn into new potentials, which are the potential to actually do the thing skillfully. Our psychical energy, our active attention, this filling out of memories, helps gain momentum and opens us to a certain direction. It directs a multiplicity of movements, all to converge together and to increase the intensity through cooperation and synergy. And of course, habit is as much a growing of psychical energy in the process of forming a habit as it also makes obsolete this psychical energy when habits become automatic and gain this new form of inertia, which is the ability to repeat the past in the present through habit. So, speech is the integration of the body and the mind. These speech disorders show us multiple layers of interpretation and constitution of speech and meaning, and therefore there are multiple ways of interrupting the process of speaking or understanding speech. This can happen at different levels, and therefore there are diversity of cases affecting different parts of the process. The body is what analyzes and traces the movements. It's what prepares our nascent movements such that our memories can fill them because of our active attention and our imaginative attention. And while the body can only enact one motion at a time, if we're speaking one word, we can't at the same time speak another word. You can't sing two notes at once. You can't be walking across the room and also sitting down at the same time. But the body can prepare multiple movements at once, and it can understand multiple movements, and it can distinguish the parts within one movement. Ultimately, though, it is memory which gives the thread of the context. It is what gathers together the motivations behind all of this analyzing and all of this pattern forming going on in the sensory motor system and through the formation of motor diagrams, right? It is what allows there to be an accumulation of this movement and of this sense into a certain force, right? It's an accumulated force that gradually builds and eventually becomes a fully articulated movement of thought, which allows for our active attention to interpret deeper layers of meaning. We interpret the speech in order to put it together and follow it, but then we also interpret it in another sense by drawing out its meaning.